So this chapter really represents now the transition from just general discussion of economics to specifically talking about macroeconomics. And macroeconomics, again, is something that you will have heard about likely in the news. The other thing that's makes macroeconomics a bit more interesting is that, at least within economics, this is the one area where at least economists are willing to admit they don't really know all that's going on, and they do allow a bit more of philosophical diversity, I guess would be the nice way to put it, or to be more technical, a bit more pluralism. By that I mean, um, the one big philosophical push happens during the Great Depression, and during the Great Depression, you get this kind of like um, you know realization that the existing understanding of the macroeconomy was incomplete. And so with the Keynesian revolution and this notion um, of things like inventories, of things like aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and of the role that fiscal policy and even monetary policy can play, um, you do get this a bit more wide scale adoption of Keynesian macroeconomics during the Great Depression in the immediate after World War II period. And then what you see is, in some sense, you see rejections of it. Um, you see an attempt by the neoclassicals to sort of adopt it in a larger sort of synthesis. And then you also see within macroeconomics this push not only to understand developed economies, but also a push to start to try to understand developing economies. Such that today, um, you know, we still have these kinds of pushes to understand the macroeconomy differently than the previous generation or the previous two generations did. Now, I got my PhD um, only in about 15 years ago, so not that long ago. Um, but already my exposure to something like modern monetary theory, um, MMT, um, is pretty limited, at least from where I went to school, because it really hadn't hit mainstream. Now, after the economic crisis, which it kind of not the same as the Great Depression, but was another moment where we really started to question our macroeconomic models that we had, that we started to get a bit more of wide scale adoption of, again, what's kind of popularly known as MMT theory. Um, and so what we know as well is that um, we do talk a great deal about um, macroeconomics. We talk about it when we talk about things like unemployment. We talk about it when things with things like inflation. We talk about it with things like um, economic growth not being fast enough or high enough. And so now let's transition now purely to chapter 5. And we already know what this distinction is, so I'm just going to kind of sidestep this here. So when we talk about macroeconomics, again, we're talking about aggregate behavior. We're talking about everyone as a whole. And one of the things that starts to distinguish microeconomics from macroeconomics, and you get this with the Keynesians, again, which is kind of where um, macroeconomic theory really starts to take shape. Um, you you get this notion, right, that when we talk about microeconomics, and we start to we draw that very kind of simple demand and supply graph. We talked about, economy pretty quickly moves to that equilibrium, and we're at an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. Well, if that's the case, there should never be any shortages or surpluses. We should always be in equilibrium. And so then why is the economy so screwed up, right? I mean, the question would be is what is it that's going on in the economy that's putting it in a position where things are fluctuating so much? And the Keynesian response to that question, the understanding that we get that makes the Keynesian work so innovative, is his notion of the sticky price. Because it's with the sticky price, the idea that prices might not immediately adjust to bring us back into equilibrium. And so if we believe that that's the case, economies could be stuck in suboptimal positions like a recession. And so then it's, if you don't want to wait for the economy to become so then the Keynesian notion is that the Great Depression can be understood in terms of sticky prices being stuck. So let's just, without going in, because we're going to look at this in much more detail, but right, so we get something like the Great Depression, which let's say we could represent it as D shifting in. Demand decreases because people feel like they have less wealth and less income. So the economy, the new equilibrium point, is right here, which is kind of a suboptimal point for the quantity, right? Where that difference would be reduced production. But how do we move back? Well, that's where the stickiness might take much longer. We get this idea of there being a long run curve, and that the stickiness might prevent us or slow us down from moving to the equilibrium fast enough. So, what do macroeconomists, and we'll get into that. So, even if that seemed confusing to you, don't worry. We will talk about that in a standalone chapter. What do macroeconomists think about first? They think about three variables. They think about GDP, which is a way that we measure production. They think about prices, and they think about employment or unemployment. And with these three things that they measure, what do they want to see? They want to see GDP growing. They want to see low unemployment, and they want to see prices relatively stable. Even before John Maynard Keynes emerges during the Great Depression, the other thing that economists had been trying to understand even before Keynes was this notion of the business cycle. That the economy seems to go through this cycle where it grows, gets really high, something happens, and then it shrinks. How can we understand why it's happening? How can we work to make sure that the peak, that the economy grows longer and that it shrinks a shorter period of time? Right, so that would be kind of the part of the focus there. And so we understand those points more formally with these terms. With economic expansion, the period where in the business cycle where the economy is growing up to a certain point, and then eventually starts to contract until it hits a recession. And we can understand that more formally with this kind of picture here. The bottoms are the troughs, the peaks of the economies where we get the highest growth. Expansion would be the upward sloping portion, the recession being the downward sloping portion. But that cycle itself, as you can see here, is tilted up, which does give us our trend growth, which in the United States is between 2 to 3% a year. And what we see when we look at overall output within the economy, we do see that upward trend. Now, the aggregate output is actually growing quite significantly, but you do see an irregularity that after the Great Depression is compromised even further, meaning that the shortages or the recessions are shortened and the growth periods are elongated. Now, these slides were made in 2020. It's not talking about COVID. If we added to this and looked at real GDP, real GDP. This is not including the Great Depression because the data formally starts getting collected right after World War II. So we're missing out on the Great Depression and World War II. But you do see how impactful COVID-19 was, right, in terms of that drop of real GDP coming from basically shutting down the economy. But yet, we quickly resolved ourselves such that we're back on. It's like you could almost draw an invisible line right here and get us back to where we were. But it did take a lot of stimulus. This gray shaded region right here is the recession, which was quite short. Okay. So now we are going to talk about these in separate standalone chapters. So I'm not going to talk about exactly how they're calculated yet. We just want to have a basic understanding at this point. So, what is the unemployment rate? The unemployment rate would be the percentage of people who are willing and able to work. That would be our labor force, those who are willing and able to work. How many of those people who are willing and able to work are not working, basically unemployed? To be unemployed, we're going to see as well, means that you are actively looking for work. You're able to work, but you're looking for work. Now, the unemployment rate becomes important as an indicator for economists because it typically tells us something about how prices are going to be affected in the economy because um, firms have to change their prices based on the wages they pay employees. When there's a lot of unemployment, there's not a lot of pressure on wages. So we may think that price inflation is smaller. When there's not a lot of unemployment, then there's a great deal of wage pressure. Wages go up, which then means typically that prices have to go up to be able to pay those wages. So that's one reason why economists care a great deal about what the unemployment rate is. That unemployment rate, as I just kind of indicated, is related to how prices change. And it could basically go in one of two directions. It could go up or it could go down. If the overall prices in the economy are going up, we call that inflation. If the overall prices in the economy are going down, we call it deflation. And then hyperinflation, which is kind of the middle term here, that would be where the economy, where the prices are rising incredibly quickly. We're talking by, um, you know, thousands of percent a year. So even as bad as inflation is right now in 2022, it still is nowhere near a hyperinflation level. Okay, so to understand this all, we have to go back again to the circular flow diagram, which we've already looked at. So I don't want to spend a great deal more time on this because we did look at this um, earlier. So again, in the circular flow diagram, we have households, firms, and the government interacting with each other within the domestic economy, and then those three groups interact with the rest of the world. And um, let's just jump to here. And in that circular flow diagram, as you can see here, each of these basically um, groups interact with each other and form markets. So firms are buying labor services from households, and households are paid. Um, sorry, the firms are paying wages. The households are providing their labor. So that constitutes right there the labor market. Firms are selling products. Households are paying for those products. That creates a goods market for us. And then the public sector exists where the government's in between. And then there are exports and imports to the rest of the world. So when we put that all together with those individual markets, um, we get a look at the economy as a whole. Again, we've already talked about this, but it is important to keep in mind that this model is highly simplistic, and it presumes a number of things which is not necessarily true, such as harmony between these groups, that the markets, that the information flows between the markets are smooth. Um, and we just don't necessarily think that that's the case. So, besides the goods market and the labor market, the other market would be the money market, the financial market. And that would be where individuals and firms save money and also borrow money. And the government does as well. So, from the goods and services market perspective, we have households demanding the goods and the firms are supplying the goods. So there's your goods and services market where the two agencies, the two groups are demanding and supplying. And that then takes us to a labor market where the households are now supplying the labor and the firms are demanding the labor. So there's another market. And then finally, we've got a money market where households, but also firms, supply money, um, savings to the market, and then households and firms borrow that money as well. So that in turn all creates a money market. These markets are constructed. These markets do have tension between the players that are in the market and the government existing as well here. So the government is involving itself in borrowing money. Now, the money market gets interesting because money can be acquired in many different ways. We can do it through bonds, which would be either treasury bonds, which is government debt, or corporate bonds, or we can do it through shares of stock, where the stock basically gives a share of equity ownership over the product. Now, the that was all fine. That right there can take us all the way up until Keynes, for the most part. Again, the Keynesian innovation comes with this active use of fiscal and monetary policy, which represent attempts to move the economy to a desired position, to basically get it out of the Great Depression that existed. Um, which is a whole, you can have entire courses on just the Great Depression, and I've taught them. So if that interests you, send me an email and I'll happily give you some other lectures that I've made about the Great Depression. Um, but what it represented was the government taking a more active role in managing the economy. Um, it was an experiment. Um, Many of the things that Franklin Roosevelt tried, which he, again took the ideas from Keynes, many of the things that he tried were good, but the amount of help that was needed was just not enough. It actually took fighting World War II and the massive government spending to support that war that really got us out of the Great Depression. And really, outside of that, outside of managing short recessions that exist from time to time, the only other challenge we've had to kind of try to mediate is stagflation. So typically, there's an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. When one is high, the other is low. Yet in the 1970s, we actually had a period of time where both were high, um, which magnifies what economists call this kind of misery index, which is again something we'll talk about a little later. This chapter again is just introducing us to all these concepts. Um, yes, economics is in literature. Um, I'm not a I don't know much about English literature except what I had to read in high school. So let's not make me talk about something I don't know much about. Okay. Um, Again, this chapter was just a kind of an introduction to the other chapters. So this chapter is relatively short because it sets the stage for the next three chapters, chapter 6, chapter 7, and chapter 8.